I thought my life had ended on that cold sidewalk alongside my hungry daughter. But then, an elderly man, wealthy and over 80, unexpectedly stopped, took us to his mansion, provided shelter, food, and even called a doctor for my little girl. I thought it was just a rare act of kindness, until one day during a casual conversation, a name I absent-mindedly mentioned left the old man frozen. That moment unveiled a shocking truth, one that changed my life forever. Hello, my name is Miles Sinclair. I'm 34 years old, a long-haul truck driver living a rough-and-tumble life on the dusty roads stretching across America. My job isn't easy. Endless days, restless nights, sleeping in the truck's cabin, the smell of diesel and the roar of the engine as my constant companions. But I never complain. Why? Because every trip, no matter how exhausting, brings me closer to home, where Elena, my wife, and Hazel, my 4-year-old daughter, are waiting. They are the light at the end of the tunnel, the reason I grip the steering wheel through blizzards or scorching summer days. Our apartment on the outskirts of Denver is nothing special. It's a tiny place with peeling paint on the walls and worn-out furniture that Elena keeps meticulously tidy. The kitchen always carries the faint smell of freshly baked bread. She loves baking, though I tease her that her loaves are sometimes hard as rocks. But to me, it's home. Every time I push open the door, Hazel's bright laughter rings out as she rushes to hug my legs like a little puppy, and I know I'm in the right place. Elena often leans against the kitchen doorway, her brown hair tied up high, her gentle smile melting away my fatigue. "Late again, Mr. Trucker?" She'd tease, her voice playful but her eyes warm. Those moments, I swear, are worth more than any reward. I'm often away from home, sometimes for a week, sometimes a month. Long deliveries from Denver to Texas, then up to Nebraska, leave little time with my family. But I always try to stay connected. From the truck's cabin during breaks on the roadside or in empty parking lots, I call Elena. Her voice over the phone is like medicine, soothing the chill of long nights. Hazel always fights for the phone, chattering about everything, from her new doll's torn dress to how Mom's pumpkin soup was super yummy. I promise Hazel a small toy from each trip, sometimes a tiny teddy bear, sometimes a red toy car. "I want one with sparkly lights, Daddy." She'd squeal and I'd smile, mentally noting to find exactly what she wanted. But over the past few months, I started noticing something was wrong. Elena, the vibrant woman always full of energy, began to seem unusually tired. She complained of stomach aches but brushed them off as probably something I ate. I urged her to see a doctor, but she just laughed it off, saying I was worrying too much. "Don't think I'm that fragile, Miles," she teased, but her eyes no longer sparkled as they once did. Her skin grew pale, the rosy cheeks I loved now faded, as if her vitality was draining away day by day. I tried to dismiss the unease, telling myself she was overworked or maybe missing me during my long trips. But that nagging feeling clung to me like a dark shadow lurking in my rearview mirror on late-night drives. Then that day came. It was a late autumn afternoon after a long haul from Kansas. I returned home, the air cold, golden leaves falling across the street, eager for a hot shower, to hold Hazel, and to sit down for dinner with Elena. I opened the door, calling out loudly, "Elena, Hazel, I'm back." But there was no response. Where was Hazel's cheerful giggle? Where was Elena's playful scolding about my dirty boots at the door? The house was eerily silent. I stepped inside, my heart starting to pound. "Elena," I called again, my voice faltering. I found her in the kitchen. Elena was lying on the floor, motionless, next to a shattered mug. Her face was ghostly white, her lips pale, her eyes half closed as if sinking into a deep sleep. I knelt beside her, my trembling hands touching her shoulder. "Elena, wake up. What's wrong?" My voice broke, panic rising. I lifted her, her body frighteningly light, as if her life had already slipped away. Hazel, my little girl, stood huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes wide with fear, clutching her torn-dressed doll. "Daddy, is Mommy sleeping?" she asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't answer, just took her hand, trying to stay calm so she wouldn't be more scared. I called an ambulance. The wait felt like centuries. Sirens wailed outside, red and blue lights flashing through the window. They loaded Elena onto a stretcher, and I held her cold hand. Hazel clung to me, sobbing. In the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and the hurried footsteps of nurses left me dizzy. I sat outside the emergency room, Hazel asleep on my shoulder, praying, though I wasn't sure what I was praying for. The doctor emerged, his face heavy. "Mr. Sinclair, we've stabilized your wife's condition. But you need to prepare yourself," he said slowly, as if delaying the inevitable. "She has liver cancer, mid-stage. The prognosis isn't very promising." The words hit me like a collapsing sky. Cancer? Mid-stage? How could this be? Elena was only 32, still healthy, laughing with me just last week, singing Hazel to sleep every night. I shook my head, searching for a glimmer of hope in the doctor's eyes. "But it's treatable, right?" "There's a way, isn't there, doctor?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The doctor sighed. "We'll do everything we can. But you should know, the disease has progressed significantly. She needs to start treatment immediately, and the costs, they won't be small. You'll need to prepare financially." He placed a hand on my shoulder as if to comfort me, but all I felt was a cold void in my chest. I looked at Hazel, still asleep, her cheeks rosy but her eyes swollen from crying. I told myself, no, I can't lose Elena. Hazel can't lose her mother. There has to be a way. That night I sat by Elena's hospital bed. She woke, weak but still trying to smile. "Why do you look so gloomy, Miles?" "I'll be fine," she whispered, her voice thin as a breeze. I held her hand, fighting back tears. I knew she was lying to keep me from breaking. I kissed her forehead, promising to do everything to keep her with us. But deep inside, I felt that dark shadow, the one that had haunted my instincts for weeks, growing larger, threatening to swallow our little family. I returned home, holding Hazel close, trying to explain that Mommy was sick but would get better soon. She nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt, as if she sensed what I was trying to hide. I looked around the apartment, once filled with laughter, now cloaked in a terrifying silence. Hazel's toys, her scribbled drawings taped to the walls, the tablecloth Elena had embroidered, all reminded me of happier days now out of reach. I wondered, how could I face the storm coming? How could I keep my promise to Hazel that her mother would be okay? Elena's illness was like an invisible monster, gnawing away at our days of happiness. I could no longer take on long-haul trucking jobs. I needed to be with Elena, with Hazel. I went to see my boss, Mr. Jackson, a stern man with thick glasses and a voice that always sounded like a growl. "I need to switch to short routes, Mr. Jackson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My wife is seriously ill and I have to be home more." He looked at me, his eyebrows knitting together as if I'd asked for the world. "You know, Miles, short routes pay less. The company can't play favorites." I nodded, swallowing the bitterness. "I understand, sir. I just need time to care for my wife." So I started running short routes from Denver to nearby cities. Each trip lasted only a few hours, but my income was cut in half, sometimes less. Our already tight budget grew even tighter. Hospital bills came like waves, each cold white sheet listing numbers that made my head spin. Medications, tests, chemotherapy. I drained our savings, sold the old TV and a few non-essential items from the house. But it was like throwing salt into the sea. I needed more money, much more, to keep Elena with me, with Hazel. In my desperation, I thought of my parents, David and Stella. They lived a few hours' drive from Denver in a comfortable house in the suburbs of Colorado Springs. I'd never been close to them. My parents were always cold, distant, as if I were a tenant rather than their son. But I had no other choice. I called, my voice trembling as I explained Elena's condition. "I need help," I said, swallowing my shame. "Just a loan. I'll pay it back, I promise." There was a long silence on the other end. Then my father's voice, rough as sandpaper, came through. "Fine, but you'll sign a promissory note. We don't do charity." I clenched my teeth and agreed. They lent me a small sum, enough to cover a few hospital bills, but it came with a note carrying sky-high interest. I signed it, my hand shaking, feeling like I was selling the last shred of my dignity. But what hurt more was learning that, while I was begging for scraps to save my wife, my parents were funding my younger brother Eric's healing vacation after a breakup. Eric, my 28-year-old carefree brother, had always been their favorite. He didn't need to sign a note or beg. A few complaints and they opened their wallets. He needs a break. Eric's been through an emotional shock, my mother said when I asked, her tone casual, as if Elena's life wasn't worth their concern. I stood frozen in their living room, feeling as though I'd been slapped. "What about Elena? What about Hazel?" I shouted, but my mother just turned away, muttering something about me being too sensitive. My father sat in his armchair, eyes glued to the TV as if I didn't exist. I returned home, my heart heavy. Our small apartment was now steeped in gloom. Hazel, only 4, didn't fully understand what was happening. She only knew her mother spent most days in bed, too weak to play as she used to. "Daddy, is Mommy better yet?" she asked, her big round eyes full of hope. I hugged her, whispering, "Soon, sweetheart. Daddy will do everything he can." But inside I knew I was lying. The treatment costs were piling up like an unclimbable mountain. I looked around the apartment. The dining table where Elena used to laugh, the rug where Hazel drew her pictures, the family photo from the park, and realized I had one last option. I mortgaged the apartment. It was the place that held all our memories, the home I swore to protect. But I had no choice. The bank employee, with a polite but cold smile, had me sign a stack of papers. "Are you sure, Mr. Sinclair?" he asked. I nodded, though my heart felt crushed. I told myself, there's still hope. I have to keep trying. Hazel needs her mother. Elena deserves to live. The mortgage money covered a few more rounds of chemo, a few more hospital stays. I clung to every shred of hope, every doctor's word that she still has a chance. But fate doesn't ask for my opinion. 3 years passed and Elena grew weaker. She was no longer the radiant woman who used to greet me at the kitchen door. She was frail, her eyes sunken, yet she still tried to smile whenever Hazel and I were near. "Miles, don't let Hazel eat too much candy," she whispered during one of her rare lucid moments. I nodded, tears falling despite my efforts to hold them back. I knew she was trying, not for herself, but for me, for Hazel. One winter morning, with snow falling heavily outside the hospital window, Elena passed away. Before she left, she held my hand, her breath faint as mist. "Take care of Hazel," she said, her voice weak but resolute. I nodded, promising her, promising myself. Then she closed her eyes, a final smile lingering on her lips. I sat there, holding Hazel, now 7, in my arms. She didn't cry, just clung silently to her old doll, but I knew her heart was breaking like mine. Elena's funeral was held in a small, modest church, almost pitifully simple. I didn't have the money for anything more. A few friends, former colleagues, and neighbors came to pay their respects. My parents showed up, but only out of obligation. They stood in the corner, my mother whispering to my father, their eyes cold. No words of comfort, no hugs. When I invited them to stay for the simple meal after the funeral, my mother only said, "We're busy. We have to leave early." They walked away, leaving Hazel and me in the empty room, surrounded by flickering candles and unspoken grief. I looked at Hazel, now taller, thinner, her eyes carrying a sadness no child should bear. I hugged her, whispering, "We'll be okay, sweetheart." But inside, I knew I was standing at the edge of an abyss. Elena was gone. The apartment was mortgaged, and debts hung over me like a noose tightening around my neck. I no longer had a steady job or a home, only Hazel, the sole light in the darkness threatening to swallow me whole. Just a few weeks after Elena's funeral, the bank came knocking. They didn't wait, didn't show mercy. A man in a suit, his voice cold as steel, handed me a foreclosure notice. "Mr. Sinclair, you've missed mortgage payments for 3 months," he said, his eyes fixed on the paperwork. I wanted to scream that I'd poured every cent into saving my wife, that I had nothing left but my little girl. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. I nodded, signed the final document, and watched them seal the door of the apartment. The place once filled with Elena's laughter, where Hazel used to run around with her tattered doll. I took Hazel's hand, pulled a suitcase with a few clothes and her toys, and walked out. The door closed behind us, shutting off an entire chapter of my life. I had nowhere to go but my parents' house in Colorado Springs. I clung to a faint hope that for the sake of blood ties, they'd open their arms to me and Hazel. I drove there, Hazel sitting beside me, clutching her doll, silent the entire way. When I knocked, my mother opened the door, her cold gaze sweeping from me to Hazel. "What are you doing here?" she asked, as if I were a stranger. I swallowed hard, recounting everything, the apartment foreclosed, the debts crushing me. "I just need a temporary place to stay and for you to look after Hazel when I'm working," I said, my voice hoarse with shame. My father, sitting in the living room with a newspaper, didn't even look up. "You can stay," he said flatly, "but you'll pay. This isn't a charity house. Rent, Hazel's care, everything needs to be clear." I was stunned. I'd thought no matter how cold they were, Hazel was their granddaughter, a little girl who'd just lost her mother. But no, they calculated every penny as if Hazel and I were a burden. "How much, Mom, Dad?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. My mother named a figure, astronomical, nearly half my income from short trucking routes. I had no other choice. "Fine," I said, signing a contract to pay monthly. In my heart, I told myself, as long as Hazel has a safe place and someone to care for her, I can manage. But I was wrong. The first few days seemed fine. Hazel stayed with my parents, and I resumed long-haul trips, trying to earn enough to cover debts and living expenses. But each time I returned, I noticed Hazel growing thinner, her eyes sunken, her clothes dirty. "Daddy, I'm hungry," she whispered one day as I walked in. I froze, rushing to the kitchen to find an empty fridge, just a few stale slices of bread and an expired carton of milk. "Where's Grandma, Hazel?" I asked, my heart pounding. She shook her head, clutching her doll tighter. I found my mother in the living room watching TV, oblivious to her granddaughter. "Mom, why is Hazel hungry?" I shouted, unable to hold back. She shrugged, her voice cold. "She's picky. How can I force her to eat? Besides, the money you send isn't enough for much." I stood there, dumbfounded. I'd given them nearly all my earnings, yet Hazel, my daughter, was starving, neglected. I searched her room, finding her clothes filthy, her bedding crumpled and unwashed. One evening, I saw Hazel curled up in a corner, coughing, her once rosy cheeks pale. "Daddy, I want to go home," she said, her voice trembling. I held her close, tears streaming down my face. Home? We didn't have a home anymore, but I knew if I left Hazel here, she'd wither like a flower buried in darkness. I made the hardest decision of my life. "Hazel, will you come with Daddy?" I asked, stroking her hair. She nodded, her eyes lighting up despite her frail body. I knew taking a 7-year-old on long-haul trucking trips was insane. The rough roads, cold nights in the truck's cabin, no school, no friends. It wasn't a life for a child. But I'd rather have her with me, no matter how hard, than let her waste away in my parents' cold care. I packed Hazel's few belongings, handed my parents the last of my money, and said, "Thank you for watching, Hazel. I'll take it from here." My mother smirked. My father didn't look up from his newspaper. They didn't try to stop me or ask how Hazel would fare. I took her hand and walked out of their house, my heart heavy but also relieved. At least Hazel would be with me. I returned to truck driving, but now with Hazel by my side. My tiny girl curled up in the passenger seat, her big round eyes gazing out at the dusty road. I did everything to make her comfortable, bought a thin blanket for her to wrap up in, saved a little money to get her cookies and milk between trips. I taught her to read from roadside billboards and told her stories about the places I'd been, though my heart was heavy. Hazel never complained, though I knew she missed school, her friends, and the days when her mother was still with us. "Daddy, where are we going today?" she asked, her voice clear and bright, as if this were an adventure. I smiled, ruffled her hair, but inside a storm of helplessness raged. One day I got an important delivery. Transporting steel from Denver to a construction site in Wyoming. My boss, Jackson, stressed its importance. "Miles, don't let me down. This job determines a big contract for the company." I nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. Hazel sat beside me, coughing softly, but I thought it was just a common cold. "You okay, sweetie?" I asked, touching her forehead. She nodded, but her cheeks were unnaturally flushed, her eyes listless. I told myself I'd give her medicine at the next stop, but deep down, a bad feeling made me shiver. Halfway through the trip, Hazel spiked a high fever. She whimpered, clutching her stomach, sweat beading on her forehead. "Daddy, I'm so tired," she whispered. Panic surged through me. I pulled over, checked her again. Her body was burning, her breathing weak. I couldn't continue the delivery. I drove straight to the nearest hospital, my heart pounding like it might explode. In the hospital room, I sat beside Hazel, holding her hand, praying everything would be okay. But I knew I'd botched the delivery. Jackson called, his voice roaring through the phone. "What the hell are you doing, Miles? Do you know how much the company lost because of you? You're fired, effective immediately." I barely mumbled an apology before hanging up. The job, the last thing keeping Hazel and me from the edge, was gone. Then the doctor came out, his face grim. "Mr. Sinclair, your daughter has hepatitis B, likely contracted from someone in the family. It's not critical yet, but she'll need long-term, costly treatment." The words hit me like a collapsing sky. I looked at Hazel through the hospital room's glass window, lying small and frail on the bed, and my heart shattered. I'd lost Elena to illness, and now Hazel was sick. I couldn't bear the thought. But where would I find the money to treat her now that I'd lost my job, lost everything? In desperation, I called my parents again. I knew I was humiliating myself, but for Hazel, I'd beg on my knees. "Mom, Dad, Hazel's sick," I said over the phone, my voice breaking. "I need help, just this once." On the other end, my mother's voice was icy. "Miles, we've helped you enough. Handle it yourself." My father cut in, his tone flat. "Don't call again. We don't have spare cash." I hung up, my hands trembling, feeling abandoned by my own flesh and blood. They didn't ask about Hazel, didn't ask how we were surviving. To them, Hazel and I were no better than strangers. With no job, no income, Hazel and I became officially homeless. I sold the truck that had been my companion for years to cover Hazel's initial hospital bills, but the money ran out quickly. We wandered Denver's streets, sleeping on park benches, wrapped in the thin blanket in the biting winter cold. Hazel, despite her illness and weakness, still tried to smile. "Daddy, where are we going tomorrow?" she asked, as if it were still an adventure. I held her close, tears streaming down my face, hiding my despair. I looked for work everywhere. Parking lots, warehouses, construction sites, but no one would hire a man dragging along a sick child. "We don't need someone with baggage," they said, their eyes cold. Those days, Hazel and I survived on coins from passers-by, stale bread from bakeries, and nights huddled under streetlights. Hazel's cough worsened, her cheeks pale, but she still clutched her doll, whispering, "Don't worry, Daddy, I'm okay." But I knew she wasn't. I wasn't either. I looked at her, my only light, fading in the storm of fate. Each of Hazel's coughs was like a knife slicing into my heart, a reminder that I was failing my promise to Elena, to keep our daughter safe, healthy, and happy. I had once been a father, a husband, a resilient truck driver, but now I was just a homeless man, cradling my little girl on the side of the road, begging for scraps of kindness from strangers. Then one frigid winter afternoon, the wind howled through Denver's bustling streets. Hazel and I huddled in a corner on the sidewalk near a coffee shop, its warm aroma taunting us from a world we couldn't enter. In front of us was a piece of cardboard I'd scavenged from a dumpster, scrawled with the words, "Please help, I have a sick child." Hazel curled up in my lap, wrapped in a thin blanket, coughing harshly. She clutched her tattered doll, her eyes listless but still managing a faint smile when she caught me looking. "Daddy, did anyone give us candy today?" she asked, her voice weak. I ruffled her hair, choking back tears. "Maybe someone will, sweetie," I said, though I knew we'd only gotten a few coins and a stale loaf of bread from a passerby all day. People hurried past, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, barely glancing at us as if we were part of the pavement, invisible, insignificant. A few paused, quietly dropping coins into the tin cup in front of me, their eyes flickering with pity before moving on. I'd grown used to their indifference, but every time Hazel shivered from the cold, I felt smaller, more helpless. I held her tighter, whispering, "Just today, Hazel. Daddy will find a way." But I knew tomorrow would likely be no different. Then, amid the rushing crowd, a figure appeared. An elderly man, perhaps in his 80s, stood out with an air of elegance. He wore a long gray coat, his hair and beard snowy white, his eyes sharp but not cold. He stopped a few steps away, observing us for a long moment. I felt his gaze, not the fleeting pity I was used to, but something deeper, as if he could see our story. Hazel coughed violently, her small body trembling in my arms. I rubbed her back, trying to soothe her, my heart racing as the old man approached. When he stood before us, his eyes lingered on my face, then shifted to Hazel. I saw a strange glint in them, a sense of familiarity, as if he recognized something profound beyond reason. His hands trembled slightly, as if pulled back to a distant memory. You have the eyes of someone I once knew," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't understand what he meant, but his gaze sent a shiver through me. Not from fear, but from the feeling that he was seeing a part of himself, a part long lost. "Is this your daughter?" he asked, his eyes moving to Hazel, and this time I saw them glisten as if he'd found something precious. She looked like a little angel I once hoped to meet. I was stunned, unsure how to respond. Hazel, despite her weakness, looked up at the old man, her big eyes curious. "Are you Santa Claus?" she asked, her innocent voice making me laugh despite the weight in my heart. The man, Vincent, smiled, a warm, emotional smile. "No, dear, I'm not Santa Claus. But I want to help you and your father." He turned to me, his voice sincere. "I'm Vincent. I can see the girl isn't well. I can help. Would you and your daughter like to come to my home? It's warm, there's food, and I'll call a doctor to check on her." I hesitated, my mind flooded with doubt. Who was he? Why was he helping us? Could this be a trap? But then I looked at Hazel, her face pale from coughing, and I knew I had no other choice. "All right, sir," I said, my voice hoarse. "Thank you." Vincent smiled, gesturing for me to stand. He led us to a sleek black car, the kind I'd only seen in movies. The driver opened the door and I carried Hazel, stepping inside, my heart a mix of fear and hope. The car took us to a grand mansion on the outskirts of Denver, a place I never imagined I'd set foot in. The iron gates opened to reveal a stately home with a meticulously tended garden. Vincent led us inside, the smell of warm wood and the soft glow of a fireplace overwhelming me. An elderly woman, likely his wife, emerged from the living room. She wore a simple wool dress, her silver hair neatly pinned up, but her eyes were strikingly warm. "Oh my, look at this little one," she said, her voice trembling as she saw Hazel. "Vincent, you did the right thing bringing them here. You two, make yourselves at home. By the way, I'm Margaret, Vincent's wife." I didn't know what to say. After days of wandering and hunger, the feeling of standing in a warm home met with kind eyes made me want to cry. Margaret led Hazel to the kitchen, setting a bowl of steaming soup and soft bread in front of her. Hazel ate eagerly, her eyes lighting up for the first time in weeks. Vincent called a doctor that evening. The doctor examined Hazel, prescribed medication, and said she needed rest and proper nutrition to recover. I held Hazel's hand, feeling the warmth of her small fingers, and for the first time a flicker of hope stirred within me. In the days that followed, we stayed at Vincent and Margaret's mansion. They gave us a spacious room with a soft bed and a window overlooking the garden. Margaret cared for Hazel like a granddaughter, telling her stories, teaching her to knit, even mending her tattered doll. With medicine and proper meals, Hazel's health improved. Her coughs lessened, her cheeks regained their rosy glow, and her bright smile, the one I thought I'd lost forever, returned. "Daddy, Mrs. Margaret's cookies are so good," Hazel exclaimed one afternoon, crumbs still on her lips. I laughed, hugging her, but my heart was heavy with gratitude and unease. Vincent and Margaret had saved us, but how could I ever repay them? I, a man with nothing but empty hands and a little girl. In the evenings, Vincent and I sat by the fireplace talking. I told him about Elena, about Hazel, about the years I'd lost everything. He listened without judgment, nodding, occasionally placing a hand on my shoulder as if to say he understood. "You're a good father, Miles," he said once, his eyes sincere. "You haven't given up on her." I looked down, unable to meet his gaze, knowing I hadn't done enough for Hazel. The days at Vincent and Margaret's mansion were a salvation. After months of wandering and hunger, the feeling of sleeping in a soft bed, eating warm meals, and hearing Hazel's laughter echo through the grand house made me feel alive again. But I often wondered, why were Vincent and Margaret so kind to us? They owed us nothing, yet they opened their arms to two strangers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One evening we gathered around the dining table in the mansion's expansive dining room. The chandelier cast a gentle glow, reflecting off pristine porcelain plates. Margaret had prepared a lavish meal, tender beef stew, creamy mashed potatoes, and a warm apple pie fragrant with cinnamon. Hazel, sitting beside me, giggled as Margaret told stories about her childhood dog, a shaggy mutt named Rusty who chased squirrels and once knocked her into the grass. He'd run after them and I'd end up tumbling. Margaret recounted, her eyes twinkling. Hazel clutched her stomach, laughing, forgetting the bite of pie in her hand. I watched her, my heart warmed, but a pang of sadness hit as I thought of Elena. If she were here, she'd love these moments. A family dinner filled with laughter and love. Then mid-meal, Vincent looked at me and asked slowly, "What about your parents? Where were they during these hard times?" I froze, my throat tightening with bitterness, then spoke in a low voice. "My parents? Thinking of them only makes my heart ache. My father, David Sinclair, always looked down on me. My mother, Stella Sinclair, always favored my brother, Eric. They never truly saw Hazel and me as family. To them, we were just a burden." Suddenly, the room's atmosphere shifted, becoming heavy and unsettling. Vincent, cutting his beef, stopped, his knife suspended in midair. Margaret, holding a porcelain spoon, dropped it to the floor, the shattering sound ringing like a small explosion in the silent room. Hazel flinched, looking from me to Margaret, her big eyes wide with confusion. I looked up, my heart pounding, unsure what was happening. Vincent stared at me, his gaze sharp yet trembling, as if he'd heard something unbelievable. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice so low it sent a chill down my spine. "David Sinclair is your father?" I nodded, a bit bewildered, feeling as though I'd touched a forbidden secret. "Yes, David Sinclair. He's my father." I couldn't understand why that name provoked such a reaction. Margaret clutched Vincent's hand, her eyes filled with worry, as if trying to hold back a wave of emotion. "Vincent, calm down," she whispered, her voice trembling. Hazel, still confused, tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, what's wrong with Mrs. Margaret? Did I do something wrong?" I patted her head, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's okay, sweetie. I'll find out." Vincent took a deep breath, as if steadying himself. "Do you have a picture of him?" he asked, his voice nearly a whisper but heavy with weight. I nodded, pulling out my phone and opening a rare old photo. the only one I still had, taken at a family gathering years ago when I was a kid. My father stood there, tall, dark-haired, with a forced smile I always felt distant from. I handed the phone to Vincent, my heart racing, sensing something terrible was about to unfold. Vincent took the phone, his hands trembling, his eyes glued to the screen as if confronting a ghost from the past. For a long moment he said nothing, his face tense, then shifting to anguish. His eyes reddened, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "David Sinclair is my son," he said, his voice choked. I sat frozen, feeling the world collapse beneath me. "Your son?" I repeated, my voice faltering, my mind reeling. Margaret, tears rolling down her face, nodded in confirmation. "Yes, David is our son, and you're our grandson." The sound of the shattered spoon still echoed in my mind, but now it was drowned out by my pounding heart, by a truth too overwhelming to bear. Hazel, sitting beside me, looked up at me, then at Vincent and Margaret, her eyes full of questions. "Are Mr. Vincent and Mrs. Margaret my great-grandparents?" she asked, her voice clear but tinged with confusion. Margaret smiled through her tears, reaching to stroke Hazel's hair. "Yes, dear. I'm your great-grandmother, and Vincent is your great-grandfather." Hazel tilted her head as if piecing together the story. I gripped her hand, trying to hold back my tears. I looked at Vincent, searching for words, but my throat felt blocked. "It can't be," I whispered. "My father said my grandparents died. He said they perished in a fire when I was young." My voice trembled with doubt and anger. Memories of David flooded back, fragmented and jagged. I recalled my childhood, asking about my grandparents, only for David to brush me off, his voice cold. "They're dead, Miles. Don't ask again." I remembered his eyes, always avoiding mine, as if hiding something. I didn't want to believe, didn't want to accept that the father who was cold to me and Hazel had woven such a horrific lie. Vincent sighed, setting the phone down, his hands shaking. "That was a lie," he said, his voice heavy with pain. "David fabricated that story to cover his sins." He began to recount, his voice slow but laden with agony, as if tearing open old unhealed wounds. David, their only son, had once been their pride. Vincent had entrusted him with managing part of Everstead Group, the transportation company he'd spent his life building. David was intelligent, ambitious, and Vincent believed he'd take the company to new heights. But David betrayed them. He secretly sold business information to competitors, plunging the company into financial ruin. Worse, he borrowed from loan sharks, using the family's name as collateral, then fled. He left us to face the consequences of his actions, Vincent said, his eyes red. We had to sell everything. The house we'd lived in for decades, everything we'd built. Debt collectors threatened us, the community scorned us. David never came back. Margaret covered her face, sobbing. "We looked for him," she said, her voice breaking. "We hired people to search everywhere, but he vanished completely. We had no word of David for decades." She looked at Hazel, her eyes filled with regret, as if blaming herself for the lost years. "If we'd known, we wouldn't have let you and Hazel suffer like this." "Oh, Hazel, I'm so sorry." She reached out, pulling Hazel into her arms, holding her tightly. Hazel, not fully understanding, hugged her back, whispering, "Don't cry, Mrs. Margaret. I like being here with you." Her innocent words made Margaret sob harder, and I felt my heart constrict. Hazel looked up at me, her eyes curious. "Daddy, why did Grandpa David say great-grandpa and great-grandma were dead?" she asked, her small voice sharp, as if trying to make sense of the tangled adult world. I shook my head, unsure how to answer. I don't know, sweetie," I said, my voice hoarse, "but Mr. Vincent and Mrs. Margaret are our real family." Hazel nodded, accepting the truth with childlike simplicity. She turned to Margaret, hugging her tighter, and whispered, "Great-grandma, can I call you Grandma Margaret?" Margaret smiled through her tears, nodding. "Of course, dear. I've wanted that for so long." Vincent watched, his eyes glistening with both pain and joy. I sat there, my mind reeling. Everything I knew about my father, David Sinclair, was a lie. The man who abandoned Hazel and me, who calculated every penny when Elena was sick, who let his granddaughter go hungry, was worse than I'd thought. He wasn't just a cold father. He was a traitor to his own family, willing to craft a fictional story to hide his guilt. Anger surged within me, a fire burning in my chest. I wanted to scream, to confront him, to ask why he could be so cruel. But at the same time, I admired Vincent and Margaret. They'd lost everything: their son, their wealth, their honor. But they didn't break. From a meager remnant, they'd rebuilt Everstead Group into a reputable transportation company, at the cost of years of loneliness and pain. After dinner, as Hazel fell asleep on the sofa, clutching her doll and the blanket Margaret had knitted, Vincent and I sat by the fireplace. Margaret brought tea, setting it before us, then sat beside Vincent, holding his hand. "Miles," Vincent said, his voice low but firm, "I know this truth is hard to accept. It took me years to come to terms with David's betrayal. But I want you to know I won't let you and Hazel suffer another day. You're my grandson. Hazel is my great-granddaughter. We're family, and family doesn't abandon each other." I bowed my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "I thought I only had Hazel, that I had no family left. But now, I just want to thank you both for saving Hazel, for giving us a place to call home." Margaret stood, hugging me as she had Hazel. "Miles, you don't need to thank us," she said, her voice warm. "Finding you and Hazel is the most precious thing to us. We lost David, but we found you too." The following morning, I sat at the breakfast table with Mr. Vincent, the early sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the warm kitchen. Hazel was out in the garden with Mrs. Margaret, giggling as she was taught how to water the flowers. I took a deep breath, set my coffee cup down, and said, "Grandpa, I want to meet my father, David. I can't let him live in peace after what he's done. I want you to come with me." Mr. Vincent looked at me, his gaze sharp but unsurprised, as if he had already anticipated my intention. He was silent for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Miles. I need to face him too, even if it's just one last time." His voice was low, carrying a resolve I had never seen before. I sensed the pain in him, but also the determination of someone ready to close the chapter on the past. We set out on a cold afternoon, the sky gray and foreboding, as if a storm was brewing. I drove with Mr. Vincent sitting beside me, his hands gripping his wooden cane tightly, his eyes staring into the distance. Hazel stayed behind with Mrs. Margaret, and I felt relieved knowing she was in loving hands. The road to Colorado Springs was familiar, but this time each passing mile made my heart pound harder. I pictured David's face, his forced smile, his cold eyes, his dry voice as he refused to help me and Hazel. Those memories, like old scars, throbbed with pain. I glanced at Mr. Vincent, wondering what he was thinking. He had lost a son, but was still strong enough to confront him. I wanted to be like him, resilient, unyielding in the face of pain. David and Stella's house was a tidy two-story home with a white picket fence and a neatly trimmed lawn. It was a symbol of the stable life David always boasted about, a life built on lies and betrayal. I parked in front of the gate, took a deep breath, and tried to suppress the anger surging within me. Mr. Vincent stepped out, his movements slow but dignified, his wooden cane tapping rhythmically on the path. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. When the door opened, David stood there, still tall, his hair now streaked with gray, but his eyes as cold as I remembered. He looked at me, his brows furrowing. "Miles, why are you here?" Then his gaze shifted to Mr. Vincent, and I saw his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. "Father?" David stammered, his voice trembling, his hand gripping the doorframe for balance. "Yes, it's me, David," Mr. Vincent said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "The man you said died in a fire. The man you betrayed." David took a step back, his eyes wide, but he quickly regained his composure, forcing a strained smile. "Father, you're alive. Why didn't you tell me? I thought..." He faltered, as if searching for an excuse. I stepped forward, standing beside Mr. Vincent, my anger flaring like a wildfire. "Stop pretending, Dad," I said, my voice cold but steady. "You knew they were alive. You lied, not just to me, but to everyone, to cover up what you did." David looked at me, a flicker of panic in his eyes, but he tried to maintain his calm demeanor. "Miles, you don't understand. It's not that simple." He turned to Mr. Vincent, his voice almost pleading. "Father, I had no choice. The company was collapsing. I was just trying to save it." Mr. Vincent shook his head, his eyes filled with pain but showing no mercy. "Save the company? You sold it out, David. You leaked information to our competitors, leaving your mother and me to bear the debts. You borrowed money from loan sharks using the family name, then fled. You left us to face the collectors, the scorn of the community. And you dared to tell everyone we were dead?" David opened his mouth to say something, but I couldn't hold back any longer. "You didn't just betray them," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You abandoned me and Hazel. When Elena was sick, you made me sign loan papers just to borrow a small amount. When Hazel was starving, you calculated every penny to care for your own granddaughter, then let her waste away. You were never a father, never a grandfather." I stepped closer, looking straight into his eyes, no longer afraid of that cold gaze. "You chose to live comfortably in this house while Hazel and I slept on park benches begging for food. Do you know how sick Hazel was? Do you know she nearly died?" David stepped back, his face pale, but he still tried to justify himself. "Miles, I did my best. You don't understand, I had my own struggles. But his words were cut off as Stella, my mother, appeared at the door, her eyes filled with confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, then saw Mr. Vincent standing beside me, his cane tapping steadily on the path. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice trembling as if sensing something terrible. Mr. Vincent stepped forward, his gaze icy yet filled with pain. "I am Vincent Sinclair, David's father," he said, his voice low but resonant like a final judgment. "The man David said died in a fire." Stella froze, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes darting between David and Mr. Vincent, as if searching for an explanation from the husband she had lived with for years. Neighbors began gathering in the front yard, whispering and pointing curiously. David tried to stay composed, his voice shaky. "Everyone's misunderstanding. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to start over." But his words were feeble, like a breeze, unable to conceal the truth. Mr. Vincent stepped forward, his cane striking the ground firmly, his voice commanding. "Enough, David. You betrayed your family, abandoned your parents, your son, and your granddaughter. You are not worthy of the Sinclair name. From this day forward, I disown you. You are no longer my son." David stood there, stunned, his eyes empty. Stella covered her face, tears streaming down, but she couldn't speak. The neighbors' whispers grew louder, their gazes shifting from curiosity to contempt. I looked directly at David, feeling for the first time that I was no longer afraid of him. "You chose this path," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "You lived with a false sense of honor, but now everyone knows the truth. Hazel and I don't need you anymore. We have a real family now." Mr. Vincent turned to me, his eyes full of understanding. "Let's go, Miles," he said, his voice low. We walked away from the house, leaving David standing there, crumbling within the facade of stability he had built. As the car pulled away, I glanced back through the rearview mirror, seeing David standing motionless at the door like a shattered statue. I didn't feel triumphant, only an emptiness in my heart, not from regret but from realizing that the father I once longed to love had never truly existed. Returning to the mansion, I saw Hazel still playing in the garden with Mrs. Margaret. She was running around, holding a tiny watering can, giggling as she soaked her grandmother's shoes. "Mrs. Margaret, roses love water, don't they?" Hazel asked, her voice clear and bright. Mrs. Margaret smiled, stroking her hair. "That's right, my dear, but don't water them too much or they'll drown." I stood there watching the two of them, and it felt as though my heart was being warmed after a long winter. Mr. Vincent placed his hand on my shoulder, his eyes shining with a confidence I had never seen before. "Miles, you have strength," he said, his voice low but firm. "I saw it when you stood before David, fearless, unyielding. You're capable of so much more." His words made me pause and reflect. For years I had lived merely to survive, to keep Hazel safe, to get through the darkest days. But Mr. Vincent saw something greater in me, something I had forgotten, the ability to rebuild from ashes. One morning he called me into his study, a room filled with books and small model trucks neatly arranged on shelves. He sat behind a wooden desk, his expression serious but not cold. "Miles, I want you to start over in the transportation industry. The field you know better than anyone," he said. "I'll provide the initial capital, but you'll have full control. I'll only step in as an advisor when you need me. Are you willing to try?" I was stunned. The transportation industry was in my blood. Years of gripping the steering wheel, navigating endless roads, had taught me everything about patience and perseverance. But starting a business, managing a company? I was just a driver with no degree, no business experience. "Grandpa, I don't know if I can do it," I said, my voice hesitant. "I've never done anything this big." Mr. Vincent smiled, the smile of someone who had weathered countless storms. "You don't need to know everything from the start, Miles. You just need to begin. I believe in you." And so, I began. With the capital from Mr. Vincent, I bought 3 old trucks, rented a small office space on the outskirts of Denver, and named the company Sinclair Transport. Not for David, but for Mr. Vincent, who had given me this chance, and for Hazel, for whom I wanted to build a better future. But it was far from easy. I lacked management experience, didn't know how to negotiate contracts or how to attract clients. The first few months were shaky, with contracts coming and going like winter winds. Some nights I sat in the tiny office staring at piles of bills and ledgers, feeling like I was sinking. We were short on staff, a few drivers quit due to low pay, and I had to drive the trucks myself when I couldn't find replacements. I was crazy to think I could do this, I told myself, my mind heavy with doubt. But Mr. Vincent and Mrs. Margaret were always there for me. In the evenings, Mr. Vincent would sit with me, patiently explaining how to read financial reports, negotiate with clients, and build trust with employees. "Don't fear failure, Miles," he said, his eyes alight with conviction. "Failure is just a bend in the road. You've driven worse roads than this, haven't you?" Mrs. Margaret brought hot meals and gentle encouragement. "You're doing this for Hazel," she said, placing her hand on mine. "And for yourself. Don't forget that." Their words, like headlights on a dark road, guided me forward. Hazel was my greatest source of motivation. Now 8 years old, she would often sit in my small office, scribbling drawings of trucks and endless roads. "Daddy, your company will have lots of trucks, right?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. I smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's right, sweetheart. I'll make it happen for you." Hazel didn't know that every time she smiled, every time she hugged me and said, "You're the best, Daddy." I found the strength to keep going. I didn't want her to grow up in poverty, like the days we slept on park benches. I wanted her to have a home, a good school, the life Elena had dreamed of for her. I poured myself into the work, learning from Mr. Vincent while applying the practical experience I'd gained as a driver. I knew what drivers needed: fair rest hours, proper insurance, and respect. I built Sinclair Transport on that philosophy. Treat employees like family. Gradually, loyal drivers stayed, bringing dedication and trust. From 3 trucks, we expanded to 10, then 20. Local businesses began signing long-term contracts, trusting our reliability and quality. Each new contract was a step forward, each new driver a companion on the journey. After 3 years, Sinclair Transport became one of Denver's most reputable transportation companies. I bought a small house, not as grand as Mr. Vincent's mansion, but warm enough for Hazel to have her own room, where she hung her drawings and placed her tattered doll on a shelf. I enrolled her in a good school where she made friends and was loved by her teachers. Every day when I picked her up from school and she ran to hug me, shouting, "Daddy, I got an A in math today," I knew I had achieved what Elena always wanted, a good life for Hazel. One evening, Mr. Vincent visited our new home. He walked in, looked around, and smiled. "Miles, you found yourself again," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I knew you could do it." I took his hand, tears quietly falling. "I couldn't have done it without you and Grandma," I said. "Thank you for believing in me." Mr. Vincent just smiled, ruffling Hazel's hair as she ran around him, and I knew in that moment we were more than just family. We were people who had weathered the storm together. News of Sinclair Transport's success spread quickly through the community. Local businesses recognized me as a reliable partner. Drivers saw me as a fair boss, and neighbors began looking at me with respect instead of pity. I was no longer the man clutching his young daughter, begging on the sidewalk. I was Miles Sinclair, someone who had built a company from nothing with the support of Mr. Vincent and Mrs. Margaret. Every evening as I sat with Hazel, helping her with math homework or listening to her stories about new friends at school, I felt a profound sense of relief. But one afternoon as I returned from the office, an old, weathered car parked in front of the house. The door opened and I froze when I saw David and Stella, my parents, step out. They no longer carried the polished appearance of before. David was gaunt, his hair almost entirely gray, his eyes sunken with anxiety. Stella, once always poised and haughty, now looked worn, her hair disheveled, her clothes wrinkled. They stood at the gate, their gazes wavering like lost souls. Hazel, playing in the yard, looked up at them, then ran to me, clutching my hand tightly. "Daddy, are Grandma and Grandpa here?" she asked hesitantly. I ruffled her hair, keeping my voice calm. "Yes, sweetheart. Let me talk to them." David spoke first, his voice hoarse. "Miles, we need to talk." I nodded, leading them into the living room but not offering them a seat. I didn't want them to feel welcome, not after everything they'd done. "What is it?" I asked coldly. Stella glanced around the house, a flicker of envy in her eyes before turning to me, her voice trembling. "Miles, we need your help. Eric's in big trouble." David jumped in, his tone urgent. "He borrowed a lot of money, then scammed some business partners. Now he's fled, leaving us to deal with the debts. The creditors and the police are pressuring us to pay because we co-signed for him. Our house, our assets, everything's about to be seized. You're our son, you have to help." I stood there, stunned. Their words hit me like a punch to the chest, not out of surprise, but because of the cruel irony of fate. Eric, the younger brother they had spoiled, the one they funded for healing trips while Elena was dying, had now turned his back on them, just as David had once abandoned Mr. Vincent and Mrs. Margaret. Memories flooded back, sharp as blades. I remembered the day I begged them for help when Elena was sick, and they offered only a small loan with a promissory note, delivered with cold stares. I remembered the days Hazel went hungry, frail in their house, when they treated her like a burden. And I remembered David's lie, claiming my grandparents were dead to cover his own sins. I looked straight into David's eyes, my voice calm but razor sharp. "You want my help? After everything you've done?" David stepped back, his eyes flickering. "Miles, we're family," he began, but I cut him off. "Family? Do you even know what family means? When Elena was sick, when Hazel was starving, you treated them like strangers. And you," I pointed at David, my voice trembling with rage, "you betrayed my grandparents." I continued, "Now Eric's abandoned you, just like you abandoned them, me and Hazel. And you think I'll forget everything and help you?" Stella covered her face, tears streaming down, but I felt no pity. "Miles, we know we were wrong," she said, her voice choked. "But we have no one else. You're our son." I shook my head, stepping closer, my gaze resolute. "I stopped being your son a long time ago. My real family is Hazel, Mr. Vincent, and Mrs. Margaret. the people who stood by me when I was at my lowest. You chose Eric, you chose selfishness. Now face the consequences. David and Stella stood frozen, their eyes a mix of shame and anger. David tried to speak, but only stammered, "Miles, you can't." I raised my hand, cutting him off. "Leave," I said, my voice icy. "Don't come back." They stood there, motionless, as if unable to believe my resolve. Then Stella tugged David's arm and they shuffled out of the house, their figures fading into the twilight. I watched them go, feeling no satisfaction, only a cold emptiness. They were tasting the same pain they had once inflicted on Mr. Vincent, Mrs. Margaret, and me. But I didn't want to become like them, consumed by resentment. I only wanted to protect Hazel, to protect my true family. Hazel, standing close to me, looked up and asked, "Daddy, are Grandma and Grandpa mad at me?" I knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "No, sweetheart. They're not mad at you. They just took a wrong turn. But we have Mr. Vincent and Mrs. Margaret, don't we?" Hazel nodded, smiling. "Yeah, Daddy. I like Mrs. Margaret's apple pie better." I laughed, kissing her forehead. The past had knocked on my door, but I had closed it, ready to move forward with those who truly loved me. In the years that followed, life for Hazel and me gradually stabilized. Sinclair Transport continued to grow, becoming a trusted name in Denver and the surrounding areas. Every morning I woke up, drove to the office, watched my fleet of trucks roll out, and felt a deep sense of pride. Not for the money or the reputation, but because I had built something honorable, a place where drivers were respected and work was done with integrity. Hazel, now 10 years old, thrived in the love of me, Mr. Vincent, and Mrs. Margaret. She excelled in school, loved to draw, and still cherished her tattered doll as a keepsake from her mother. Each time I saw Hazel running around in my grandparents' garden, laughing with Mr. Vincent or helping Mrs. Margaret bake, I knew I had kept my promise to Elena, to give Hazel a life filled with love. One day, Mr. Vincent called me to the mansion, his expression serious yet warm. "Miles, I want you to attend the Everstead Group's major meeting next week," he said, his voice low but resolute. "As my grandson, and more importantly, as someone I trust." I was taken aback, a bit anxious. Everstead Group was a transportation empire with hundreds of employees, shareholders, and partners across the country. I was just a former homeless truck driver now running a small company. "Grandpa, I'm not sure I'm up to it," I said hesitantly. Mr. Vincent smiled, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You've proven yourself capable long ago, Miles. Just go and be yourself." The meeting took place in a grand conference hall in downtown Denver with rows of red velvet chairs, bright chandeliers, and an air of formality. Shareholders, partners, and even local journalists filled the room. I stood beside Mr. Vincent wearing the suit he had bought for me, feeling out of place among these powerful figures. Hazel, in a green dress sewn by Mrs. Margaret, sat in the front row, her eyes sparkling as she looked at me like I was her hero. Mrs. Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand, smiling encouragingly. I took a deep breath, trying to quell my nerves. Mr. Vincent stepped up to the podium, his wooden cane tapping steadily, his voice resonating through the hall. "Today I stand here not only as the chairman of Everstead Group, but as a father and a grandfather," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Years ago I lost my son, not to death but to betrayal. But fate brought me my grandson, Miles Sinclair, and my great-granddaughter, Hazel." He turned to me, his eyes filled with pride. "Today, I announce my will and succession plan. I am transferring all my assets and leadership of Everstead Group to Miles Sinclair and Albert Carver, my loyal partner who stood by me through the darkest days." The hall fell silent, then murmurs rippled through the crowd. I stood there, my heart pounding, unable to believe my ears. Albert Carver, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, stood and bowed in gratitude to Mr. Vincent. I looked at him, searching for words, but could only nod, tears quietly falling. Mr. Vincent continued, his voice commanding. "Miles wasn't chosen because he's my grandson. He was chosen because he's proven himself through resilience, integrity, and love for his family. He rose from ashes, built a company with kindness, and is an example for us all. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted from the back of the hall. David, Stella, and Eric, my younger brother, appeared looking haggard but defiant. David strode forward, his voice booming. "Vincent, you can't do this. I'm your son. I have a right to the inheritance." Eric chimed in, his voice shrill. "Everstead Group belongs to the family, not some truck driver like Miles." Stella stood behind them, her eyes wavering, silent. The hall held its breath, all eyes on them. Mr. Vincent remained calm, as if he had anticipated this. He signaled for his assistant to bring out a thick stack of documents, placing them on the table. "David, I knew your selfish nature would bring you here," he said, his voice cold as steel. "I've quietly gathered evidence of your past actions. Contracts you signed to sell information to competitors, loan agreements with loan sharks, and witness testimonies about how you fled, leaving your mother and me to face the debts." He turned to Eric, his gaze piercing. "And you, Eric, defrauded partners, ran away, and left your parents to deal with creditors. Neither of you is worthy of the Sinclair name, let alone Everstead Group." David bowed his head, his hands trembling. Eric, his face flushed with shame, turned and fled, unable to face the crowd. Stella covered her face, tears streaming down, but said nothing. The hall erupted in applause, shareholders and employees standing in support of Mr. Vincent's decision. Cameras flashed as journalists captured the moment. I stood there, no longer the abandoned son, but a leader publicly acknowledged. I stepped up to the podium, took Mr. Vincent's hand, and looked down at Hazel, who was clapping enthusiastically, her eyes full of pride. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling but steady. "I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past generation. This company will be built on kindness, so future generations know that true value lies not in blood, but in honesty and responsibility. I promise to lead Everstead Group with all my heart. For my family, Hazel, Mr. Vincent, Mrs. Margaret, and everyone who has trusted us." The hall roared with applause again. Hazel ran up to the podium, hugging me tightly. "You're amazing, Daddy," she cheered, and I laughed, holding her close. I looked at Mr. Vincent, who smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. Mrs. Margaret from the front row wiped her eyes, nodding as if to say she was proud of me. Standing on the podium amidst the lights and applause, I thought about my journey. From the days of homelessness, starving alongside Hazel, to this moment, leading a company with a true family by my side. Life had taught me that a person's worth lies not in what they own, but in how they face adversity, how they love and protect those dear to them. I learned that family isn't about blood, but about those who choose to stay, to share your pain and joy. My advice to anyone lost in the storms of life is to hold on to hope, no matter how small. Find the people who truly love you and don't be afraid to start over. I was once a homeless truck driver, but with Hazel, Mr. Vincent, Mrs. Margaret, and faith in myself, I found my path. And I hope you too will find yours, guided by honesty, kindness, and love.